620 million. Just take a second and really think about that number. Imagine an area spanning 22 states suddenly, without any warning at all, plunging into complete darkness. Traffic lights just dying, trains halting dead on their tracks, hospitals frantically scrambling to get backup generators online. That staggering number? That represents the amount of people who lost power during the massive grid failure in northern India back in July 2012. We're talking roughly 9% of the entire global population at the time, just left totally in the dark for hours. It really makes you wonder, right? How is electricity just always there when we flip a switch? Until, catastrophically, it suddenly isn't. You see, the fundamental tension of modern life is that electricity can't be easily or cheaply stored on a massive scale. So when you turn on your coffee maker in the morning, a power plant somewhere has to simultaneously generate that exact amount of electricity. Generation has to perfectly match demand in real time, literally second by second. It is the ultimate high-wire act.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to completely unpack the intricate engineering and the incredibly high-stakes economics that actually keep our lights on. We'll be exploring exactly how grid operators predict our behaviors, how they crunch the numbers, and how they build massive infrastructures just to make absolutely sure that when you flip that switch, the power is waiting for you.
Here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll look at the daily power balance, then visualize the load curve. After that, we'll dive into the economics of electricity, look at how we size up power plants, and finally, we'll talk about what happens when the grid fails.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the daily power balance.
To keep the whole system from collapsing, grid operators are basically constantly juggling two foundational yet very different forces of consumer demand. If you look at the baseline of energy usage, that is your base load. It represents the absolute minimum level of electricity demand required over a full 24-hour period. It's that continuous load needed for things that literally never turn off. Above that, though, you have the peak load. These are the highly volatile, temporary spikes in demand when everyone wakes up and turns on their heaters, or when heavy factories power up their machinery for the day. And because these two types of loads are so drastically different, we actually build entirely different types of power plants to handle them. Baseload plants, think large thermal, nuclear, or hydro stations, are heavy-duty. They cost a fortune to build, but they run continuously, 24/7, with incredibly high efficiency and very low operating costs. But, you can't just turn a nuclear plant on and off in 5 minutes to handle a sudden demand spike. For that, we use peak load plants. These are usually your gas or diesel stations. They have a lower upfront cost and are highly flexible. They can start up very quickly when demand spikes and shut down just as fast when it drops.
Which brings us to Section 2, visualizing the load curve.
So how do engineers actually track these wild daily swings in demand so they know which plants to turn on? Well, they use a chronological load curve. Looking at this 24-hour cycle, you can trace exactly how the load climbs and falls throughout the entire day. You can see the load is relatively low at night, it steps up around 6 a.m., hits a massive peak maybe around 6 p.m., and then drops back down. The total area under this curve tells engineers exactly how much energy was generated in that specific period. But what's really brilliant is what happens when we rearrange that exact same data. This is a load duration curve. Instead of putting it in chronological order, the loads are arranged from the highest magnitude on the left to the lowest on the right. This is a game changer because it lets operators instantly see exactly how many hours the grid experiences its most extreme peak loads compared to its base loads. But predicting demand is also about knowing what's actually plugged into the grid in the first place. Enter connected load. This is the continuous rating of literally every piece of equipment connected to the supply system. Every single light bulb, that blender you use maybe once a month, massive industrial motors, if it's plugged in, it counts toward the connected load. Now, since operators know they can't perfectly predict when you're going to turn on your blender, they absolutely have to rely on backups. Think of the spinning reserve as the grid's immediate, split-second safety net. This is generating capacity that is already synchronized to the grid. The turbines are physically spinning, and they are ready to take on additional load within seconds or minutes if there's a sudden spike. If spinning reserves are the first responders, the cold reserve is the backup squad. These generating units are completely offline. They're there to help provide power if things get really tight, but it takes precious time to fire them up, get them up to speed, and fully synchronize them with the power system. And finally, we have firm power. This is the ultimate guarantee.
It's the power that is guaranteed to always be available from a plant, even during adverse conditions or crazy emergencies. It is the absolute bedrock of reliability that the entire grid depends on. Let's move on to Section 3, the economics of electricity. At the end of the day, running a power grid is just a massive financial balancing act. The formulas we use to calculate this might look a little intimidating at first glance, but they are essential tools for economists to figure out the plant capacity factor. Simply put, this just measures how much actual energy a plant produces compared to the absolute maximum energy it could have produced if it ran at full throttle all the time. It basically tells operators exactly how efficiently a multi-million-dollar asset is being utilized. There are a few key economic concepts here, but I really want to focus on the diversity factor. It is the ratio of the sum of individual maximum demands to the overall maximum demand of the system. What does that mean in plain English? It mathematically proves that not every consumer turns on their appliances at the exact same time. Because of this beautiful diversity in our daily habits, engineers can get away with building a system that has a much smaller capacity than the total connected load. If everyone actually turned everything on at once, the system would have to be impossibly massive and, frankly, astronomically expensive. Next up, Section 4, sizing the power plant. With all of this complex economic and load data in hand, how do engineers actually decide what to build? Well, they follow some pretty strict rules. They match generating units directly to the load curve. They factor in that about 20% of the power will literally just be lost while traveling through miles of transmission lines. And they always keep a 15 to 20% reserve capacity. But arguably the smartest rule? Instead of building one giant generator, they install multiple smaller units of equal capacity. If one breaks, the whole grid doesn't just go down. Maintenance is a breeze, and you only need to run what you actually need during those low demand hours. It's incredibly efficient. Which brings us to our final section, Part 5, when the grid fails. Because despite all this brilliant engineering, perfectly calculated economics, and those built-in reserves, things still go wrong. When that incredibly delicate balance breaks, grid faults can be triggered by a whole myriad of factors. Nature throws extreme weather and hurricanes at the transmission lines, aging tech and transformers just break down, you've got human error, and sometimes even massive illegal energy theft that throws off all the demand predictions. If demand suddenly outpaces generation, you get power surges, overheating, and then a cascade trip. That's when one generator fails, suddenly shifting its load to the next one, which overloads and fails, creating a rapid, pretty much unstoppable domino effect. When the system gets heavily stressed, operators are basically left with two unpleasant outcomes. The first is a brownout. This is a partial, temporary reduction in system voltage. But what's fascinating is that brownouts are often entirely intentional. Grid operators will deliberately do this to relieve an overstressed system and prevent a total collapse. It saves the grid, even though your sensitive electronics might really hate it. The alternative, if a brownout doesn't work or a cascade failure happens, is a blackout. And that is a complete, total interruption of power. Just zero electricity. And modern blackouts, they are just breathtaking in their scale. Take 2003, when the Northeast U.S. blackout affected millions of people, thanks to a nasty combination of high demand and software bugs. In 2005, 20 states in India went entirely dark. Then came that historic 2012 India outage we talked about at the very beginning, affecting that staggering 620 million people over 2 long days. And the threats are constantly evolving. In 2015, Ukraine suffered a major blackout, not from weather or a spike in demand, but from a targeted cyber attack on their energy distribution networks. All of this leaves us with a pretty critical thought to ponder. As our reliance on electricity deepens every single year, with electric vehicles everywhere, massive AI data centers, and our entire global digital infrastructure, is our interconnected power grid becoming just a little too complex to perfectly balance? The next time you casually flip a light switch, take a second to appreciate the invisible, fragile, highly mathematical miracle happening right behind your walls just to make that bulb glow. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember to keep questioning the world around you.